September in Middleton, and the sun was honey-coated arsenic. On the 28th floor of the Peak Capitol Tower, the air conditioning ran so low that cold hissed into every inch of skin, but Sophie's back was already soaked through. She had been working 7 consecutive nights. On her desk sat 32 discarded drafts of data models. A coffee cup at her elbow had dried black residue at the bottom. The bruised dark circles under her eyes looked as though someone had painted them on with thick ink. But she couldn't stop. The suburban cultural tourism town project, worth over £100 million, was her one chance in 3 years to stand tall and prove herself. For 3 years, she had been an outsider. While others hovered around the department director, fetching tea and flattering him, Sophie kept her head down and refined every set of figures to 2 decimal places. While others formed cliques and jockeyed for favor, she stayed alone in the silent office late into the night, staring at her screen until her eyes burned. She believed in one thing: in the workplace, ability speaks for itself. Work hard, and eventually you'll be heard. 3 days after the bidding conference, Sophie moved into her new office on the 26th floor of Oceanic Tourism's headquarters. The office wasn't large, but one entire wall was floor-to-ceiling glass, facing the river. Morning light bounced off the water and scattered in golden flakes across her desk. She sat in a brand-new ergonomic chair, 3 monitors glowing before her, the project schedule on the left, the suburban town proposal in the middle, and real-time industry news scrolling on the right. She spent 2 full days upgrading the proposal from the bidding version to an execution-ready plan, translating theoretically sound models into engineering parameters that contractors could actually use. Dylan had assigned her 4 people, 1 cost estimator, 1 retail operations specialist, and 2 recent graduates fresh from top universities. In 6 hours, she'd stripped out all their old working habits and rebuilt them from scratch. Dylan watched the transformation with raised eyebrows. 3 years buried at Peak, he said, leaning against her door frame with an iced Americano in hand. How much did you have pent up? Sophie took a sip. The longer it's compressed, the higher it springs. Dylan laughed. He was 37, with 15 years in the tourism industry, and he'd seen all types. But Sophie's look, the look of someone who'd died and come back, he'd only ever seen on a former soldier's face. That man now ran his company's safety division with a spotless record. Groundbreaking ceremony is set for the 8th of November, Dylan said. The district officials will be there, and the press. You'll give a 3-minute speech. Sophie nodded, asking no further questions. After Dylan left, she put down her iced coffee and opened a folder. Inside were all the messages she'd received since leaving Peak, 28 private notes from headhunters on professional networking sites, 5 job offers from rival firms, 3 invitations to speak at industry forums, and 7 WeChat messages from former Peak colleagues, tentative, guilt-ridden little notes. She hadn't replied to any of them. She opened one message from a colleague named Ruby, the only person who, after that final review, had slipped her a packet of tissues, though even Ruby hadn't dared to speak up at the time. Ruby's message ran long: everyone was afraid of Megan and Director Connor, no one dared to stand up. Afterwards we all regretted it. Are you okay? It ended with a crying emoji. Sophie stared at it for half a minute. She could feel Ruby's guilt, genuine, but too late, like an umbrella arriving after the monsoon. She typed back, "I'm fine, thanks." Then she closed the chat. Not angry. But not warm enough to thaw. She turned her phone face down and refocused on the project schedule. A calendar reminder popped up. She had a meeting with a lawyer at 3 that afternoon. The civil case against Ethan, the £46,000, was set for its first hearing in 2 weeks. She arrived 15 minutes early at the law firm's building, bought a latte at the ground floor cafe, and sat by the window. The lawyer, Grace, was a Dylan recommendation, early 30s, short hair, blunt and efficient, specializing in commercial disputes. Sophie had liked her immediately. Grace didn't waste words, every sentence landed on statute and evidence, like a finely tuned shredder. Grace walked in on the dot, carrying a manila file. She sat down and cut straight to business. I've gone through the chat records, transfer receipts, and bank statements. £46,300, spread over 7 transfers across 11 months, all labeled household expenses and shared rent. There's no formal IOU, but the chat logs include phrases like, I'll pay you back later, and once my project bonus comes through, I'll transfer it. That's enough to establish a loan relationship. Good odds at the first hearing. Sophie nodded. I want everything back, principal and interest. Grace pushed up her glasses. Interest at the base lending rate from each transfer date. I'd also suggest adding a claim for emotional distress. The amount won't be huge, but it adds pressure. Add it. Done. Grace marked the file and closed it, then looked at Sophie. Off the record, do you hate him? Sophie's fingers paused on her coffee cup. Tiny beads of condensation clung to it. She watched her fingertip wet them, then answered, I did. Not anymore. Why? Hating takes energy. Sophie pushed the cup aside. I'm saving mine for things that matter. Grace smiled, stood, and shook her hand. See you in court. Sophie left the firm as dusk was falling. She didn't take a taxi. She walked slowly towards the tube station, the autumn wind pushing through her collar with the sour smell of rotting plane tree leaves. She passed a flower shop and stopped. In the window stood a large bunch of white lisianthus, clean as first snow. She stood for 5 seconds, then went in and bought a small bunch. As she walked back to the office with the flowers, her phone buzzed. Dylan had forwarded a screenshot of Peak Capital's internal staff changes. Connor had been shifted out of the tourism division, demoted to a deputy role in facility management, a quiet burial. Megan's entry read simply, terminated. Sophie enlarged the screenshot and looked at Connor's name. 3 years ago, when she'd joined Peak, Connor had been that young director who gave the onboarding speech, our department values real talent. She'd believed him. She'd buried her head and worked for 3 years, pulling all-nighters, and in the end, she'd been called unprofessional and thrown out. She closed the image and texted Dylan, good. Back in her office, nearly 7, she put the lisianthus in a spare water bottle and set it beside her monitor. The white petals looked unnaturally still under the screen's glow. She stared at them a moment, remembering that Ethan had given her white lisianthus on their first date. He'd said the flower meant eternal love. She turned the vase so the flowers faced away from her, and reopened the project file. At 11 that night, she closed her laptop and headed for the lift. As the doors opened, a man stood inside, tall, wearing a dark overcoat, scrolling on his phone. He glanced up when the doors chimed, gave her a polite nod, and went back to his screen. Sophie recognized him. This was Oscar, Oceanic Tourism's new design director, hired the previous week. She'd only seen him once, at Dylan's introduction meeting. Word was he'd spent 8 years at one of the top 3 design firms in the country, and 2 of his projects had won international awards. Dylan had paid a premium to bring him over. Oscar looked early 30s, with sharp features and a narrow set to his eyebrows, unapproachable when he wasn't smiling. He didn't try to make conversation on the ride down. Neither did Sophie. They stood in silence for 30 seconds. When the lift reached the ground floor, Sophie stepped out and heard Oscar's voice behind her, Sophie. She turned. He'd put his phone away, his expression neutral. I looked at your zoning plan for the town this afternoon. The circulation on plot 3 is problematic. From the main entrance to the core experience zone, visitors walk 470 meters, that's nearly a third of a mile, with no intermediate stopping points. You'll lose at least 15% of family groups in that stretch. Sophie blinked. She'd focused the proposal on investment and operational models, leaving the circulation plan to a junior assistant. She'd reviewed it twice, but she hadn't dug into visitor psychology. Oscar's observation, she realized, was right. Have a fix, she asked. Oscar nodded. Tomorrow, 10 in my office. Half an hour. He didn't wait for a reply, just turned and strode towards the car park, his coattails flicking in the night breeze. In seconds, he'd vanished into the underground entrance lights. Sophie stood still for a moment, then felt the corner of her mouth lift. It had been a long time since she'd met someone like that, direct, no niceties, straight to the solution. Her kind of person. At 10 the next morning, she knocked on Oscar's door. His desk was spread with a huge topographic map of Plot 3, covered in red and blue pencil marks. He gestured her to sit, then picked up a red pen and drew a wavy line across the map, connecting the entrance to the core area. 3 new features along the way: a children's interactive fountain, a pop-up cultural retail zone, and a small amphitheater. Each spaced about 150 meters apart, which matches the average walking fatigue interval. The additional cost is around £280,000, but from the projected increase in dwell time and secondary spending, it'll pay for itself within 3 months. Sophie leaned in to look. His annotations were meticulous, every node marked with dimensions, estimated construction timelines, even reserved utility connections. The more she saw, the more she was impressed. He'd had her proposal for barely 12 hours, and he'd already worked out construction details. Oscar, is this your normal speed? She asked. He capped the pen. I don't like dragging things out. Sophie looked at the drawing and a thought surfaced. She paused for 2 seconds, then said, the Plot 3 improvements, would you be willing to present this jointly with me to Dylan? I want to brand it as a micro-upgrade story for the town, to show the press that we're not just building a project, but refining it over time. Oscar glanced up. Okay. 1 word. But from then on, Sophie noticed that Oscar's words landed like nails, each one driven in and hard to pull out. Over the next week, Sophie and Oscar worked 4 evenings in a row to polish the Plot 3 upgrade. They clicked instantly. She did the numbers, he did the drawings, with almost no unnecessary talk. Dylan saw the proposal on Friday afternoon, signed off on the extra budget immediately, and called them into his office for tea. You two work faster than I did when I was chasing my wife, Dylan said, leaning back in his chair, his eyes moving between them. But I'll warn you, once construction starts, Peak's people won't sit still. Sophie held her teacup, silent. Dylan went on, that piece of land, Peak had been eyeing it for 2 years. Connor was the one pushing it. Now that we've taken it away, even though Peak headquarters has disciplined Megan and Connor, the rest of their tourism division won't take it lying down. I've heard that their new tourism director, a man named Nathan, is a tough customer. He used to work in investment banking. Nasty streak. Nathan. Sophie repeated the name. You know him? Heard of him? Sophie put her cup down. I saw him once at an industry summit. His negotiation style is all or nothing, either he takes everything, or he burns the table. Dylan raised an eyebrow. Worried he'll burn yours? Sophie didn't answer directly. She glanced at Oscar, who was leaning against the window, scrolling on his phone, apparently not listening. But his ear had twitched, and Sophie noticed. I'm not afraid of him burning the table, she said. I'm afraid he'll saw the legs off before he does it. Dylan laughed out loud. But Sophie knew it wasn't funny. She understood Peak's internal workings too well. Nathan had been parachuted in to clean up after Connor's fall. He wouldn't accept the reputation of being the man who'd lost a major project on his watch. He'd try to claw back. The easiest way was to sabotage Oceanic's execution phase. 3 days before the groundbreaking, the trouble came. Sophie was in a progress meeting with the main contractor when a junior assistant from retail operations pushed the door open, looking flustered. "Sophie, the environmental impact assessment for Plot 4 has been stalled. The District Environmental Bureau says we're missing dry season groundwater sampling. They want us to redo it, which would take at least 4 to 5 working days." Sophie sat up straight. "We did the dry season sampling. I personally reviewed the report." The assistant handed her the returned application. Sophie flipped through it, frowning. The rejection letter stated, "Missing groundwater level monitoring data for July to September 2026, dry season." But she remembered distinctly submitting those 72 pages of data, sample points, time series, water level curves, all complete. She called the Bureau's approvals desk on the spot. The officer was polite but firm. "It's been returned, go check your own materials. The file we received does indeed lack that section. If you disagree, you can file an administrative appeal." Sophie hung up and tapped her fingers 3 times on the table. No appeal. 4 to 5 days she couldn't wait, the groundbreaking was imminent, and without the approval, the press releases, full compliance, wouldn't hold. She texted Dylan, then drove straight to the Bureau. On the way, she called the third-party monitoring firm that had done the original sampling. They confirmed that the data had been submitted, both electronic and hard copies, with a signed delivery receipt. A signed receipt. Sophie's eyes lit up. At the next red light, she pulled up her phone backups, scrolled to external documents, and found a photo of the delivery receipt. The receiver's signature was unmistakably someone from the Bureau's approvals desk. At the Bureau, she skipped approvals and went straight to the Internal Oversight Office. The oversight officer saw the receipt photo, cross-checked the Bureau's filing records, and within half an hour, the truth surfaced. A staffer in approvals had received the full submission, pulled out the 72 pages, fed them into a shredder, and rejected the application as incomplete. When confronted, the staffer turned white and mumbled that a friend had asked for the favor. Sophie knew exactly who that friend was. That evening, the Bureau reinstated the approval process. The following morning, the permit came through, 5 working days ahead of schedule. When Dylan called to ask how she'd done it, Sophie replied with 3 words, "I had proof." Dylan was silent for 5 seconds, then said, "You right now, you're like a blade that's been quenched and sharpened." Sophie sat in her car, the window half down, the autumn wind blowing her hair across her face. She turned off the navigation and stared at the grey-blue sky through the windscreen. She remembered who she'd been a year ago, the Sophie who'd pulled all-nighters at peak, had her proposal stolen, and told herself, "I have a clear conscience." Then, she'd thought a clear conscience was enough. Now she knew, a clear conscience was just the entry ticket. Once you were inside, what mattered was how steadily you held your knife, and how cleanly you struck. But she forgot that the sharpest knife is always hidden behind the sweetest smile. "Still at it, Sophie?" A voice as saccharine as if it had been injected with 3 pounds of sugar floated from behind her. Sophie's fingers froze for a fraction of a second. Megan, in her 7-centimeter heels, glided to her side, bent close, so close that her breath almost brushed Sophie's ear, and let her gaze greedily sweep across the dense calculations on the screen, while her mouth said the most innocent words, "You've been at it for 7 days straight. Doesn't your boyfriend worry about you? Your eyes look like they're sinking into your face." Sophie didn't look up. Her fingers kept tapping the keyboard. Part of the job. She was naturally reserved, too cold for pleasantries, and couldn't be bothered to strip away the mask of sweet concern that Megan wore so well. But Megan wasn't here for small talk. She pulled over a chair, sat down, propped her chin on her palm, and fixed Sophie with a look of watery sympathy. "Tomorrow's the final review. and the director and the VP will both be there. I'm worried you might get nervous and miss something important. How about you send me the full source files, the working drafts, and all the raw calculation data? I'll study them tonight, so tomorrow if you stumble, I can jump in and cover for you. It was the same script, the same routine. For 3 years, Megan had used that pretense of sharing the load and teamwork to nibble away at the small projects, draft proposals, and data templates that Sophie had painstakingly built. Sophie had let it slide, she considered it part of learning. But this time was different. This was the ultimate zero-flaw proposal she had forged from 3 years of accumulated work, 7 sleepless nights, 3 field trips to the suburban site for scrapped frameworks, and 217 sets of dynamic data. It was her life. Sophie slowly stopped typing, lifted her gaze, and fixed Megan with eyes as cold as a lake just beginning to freeze. No. Unfinished core materials are not to be shared, company policy. Megan's sugary smile curdled as if acid had been thrown on it. She stared in disbelief. Sophie, what do you mean? The next second, she shot to her feet, her voice leaping an octave, sharp enough to slice through the silence of the entire floor. I'm only trying to help you carry the pressure. I'm afraid you'll crack tomorrow on your own, and this is how you treat me. We're colleagues, do you think I'm going to steal your credit? You're being petty and selfish. That deliberately raised voice landed precisely in the ears of the few colleagues still working overtime. Instantly, dozens of glances swiveled towards them, curious, speculative, gleeful. What's up with Sophie today? She's usually so easygoing. Probably scared someone will take the credit. This project is huge. Megan offered to help, and she pushes her away. That's pretty cold. The whispers slithered like snakes, hissing into Sophie's ears. Sophie closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they held nothing but sharp clarity. She stood, back straight, and met Megan's suddenly darkening gaze without flinching. The core concept, the data modeling, the field research, I did every bit of it myself. Unfinished drafts are not to be shared outside the team. That's the rule, not a personal attack. Rule was a wall of iron that choked off every word Megan tried to throw. Megan's face cycled through shades of white and green. She stood rigid for 5 full seconds, and a flash of viciousness crossed her eyes, then just as quickly, she draped herself in wounded magnanimity, sighed, and said in a plaintive voice, "Fine. I was meddling. You work hard, just don't mess up tomorrow." She turned and walked away, her heels striking the floor with a sharp thud that seemed to land on Sophie's heart. Sophie watched her retreat and felt a chill creep up her spine. She knew Megan too well. Having been humiliated in front of everyone tonight, Megan would not let the final review pass without revenge. A close colleague sidled over and lowered her voice, "Sophie, you're too blunt." Megan never forgets a slight, and she knows how to whisper sweet nothings into Director Connor's ear. "Tomorrow you might." "I have a clear conscience," Sophie cut her off, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk until her knuckles went white. "The proposal is mine. The credit belongs to me." She had endured for 3 years, not out of weakness, but out of disdain. This time, she wouldn't yield an inch. At 11 that night, the floor finally emptied. Sophie finished her final data check. She encrypted and backed up every draft, iteration log, research notebook, late-night revision timestamps, and raw calculation sheets, 1 copy on her hard drive, 1 in a private cloud, both double-locked. She kept every piece of evidence, purely to defend herself tomorrow. As she came downstairs, the evening wind carried the last of the summer heat, but it couldn't blow away the suffocating weight in her chest. Under the streetlight, a white car was parked silently. The window rolled down to reveal her boyfriend Ethan's gentle, handsome face. They had been together for 5 years, from university through early career. He was the only warm color in Sophie's high-pressure life. Ethan got out, took her heavy laptop bag, and rubbed his thumb gently across her tired brow. His voice was tender, as if soothing a child. Up this late again? Your eyes are hollow. Sophie leaned into his shoulder, let all her tension fall, and quietly told him about Megan. She didn't cry, but her voice held a tremor she couldn't hide. I have a feeling, tomorrow won't be smooth. Ethan held her tighter, stroked her hair, and said with steady assurance, don't be afraid. Your proposal is flawless, and everyone knows what you can do. Even if Megan tries something, she can't overturn that. I believe in you. His warm embrace and firm promise made Sophie finally lower her guard. Yes, she had solid proof, an unshakable proposal, and a clear conscience. But she didn't know that the most dangerous enemy is never the one in front of you, it's the poison handed to you by the one beside you. The boyfriend she trusted with everything, her light, her warmth, he had long been secretly entangled with her nemesis. That night was restless, filled with nightmares. At 10 the next morning, the final review began on time. The meeting was of unprecedented scale. Department Director Connor, the Deputy Director, all project leads, and even the company Vice President were present. Sophie took a deep breath and stood to prepare the screen. The instant her finger clicked the mouse, her blood froze in a fraction of a second. The projection screen slowly lit up. The cultural tourism town proposal, the one she had honed over 7 sleepless nights, with all its frameworks, data, models, risk assessments, and zoning plans, was displayed in full detail. Every element was exactly as she had built it. Except for one thing. The credit line in the lower right corner had been crudely tampered with. What had read, Proposal Lead, Sophie, now read, Proposal Lead, Megan. Absolute silence. Dozens of eyes fixed on Sophie, surprised, probing, mocking, pricking like needles. Sophie's mind roared. Her fingers went numb. She had double encrypted and double backed up her work. How could it have been altered? In the next moment, Megan rose gracefully in her beige suit, wearing a warm, confident smile, and gave a slight nod to the senior executives. Good morning, everyone. Today I'll present the billion-pound cultural tourism town proposal, which I have led from conception to completion. This proposal leverages the trend towards suburban cultural tourism, with light capital investment and long-term operational sustainability. She rattled off Sophie's core logic, niche creative concepts, and proprietary risk calculation formulas as if they were her own. Her tone was so assured that it seemed those sleepless nights had been hers. Director Connor nodded vigorously, his admiration overflowing. He announced on the spot, Megan. Remarkable progress. Clear thinking, solid execution, this project is a landmark for the department. You're a model for the team. Megan bowed slightly, modest and polished. Thank you, Director. For the department's growth, I gave it my all. Not a word about Sophie. Sophie's chest surged with cold fury. She shot to her feet, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Megan, every piece of research, every data point, every framework and iteration in this proposal was done by me alone. You had no part in the core work. How dare you change the credit and claim my work as your own? A wave of shock rippled through the room. Everyone had only ever seen her quiet and accommodating, never had she publicly challenged anyone like this. Megan's expression flickered, then she quickly mustered a hurt, tear-filled look. Sophie, how can you say that? I've led this project from start to finish, you only helped with some basic data organization. I know you've been under a lot of pressure lately, but you can't just seize credit and twist the facts in front of everyone. In one stroke, she painted Sophie as the jealous, overreaching troublemaker. Director Connor's face turned to iron. He barked, Sophie. Enough. This is a meeting, not a tantrum. Megan has been coordinating resources and driving the project forward. When did you ever lead any core work? I have proof. Sophie met his gaze squarely. I have every working draft, iteration log, late-night revision timestamps, field visit photographs. All the original evidence proves I created this alone. She was calm, sure, and confident. Megan's eyes flickered with panic, but she suppressed it and whined, "Director, those are just scraps of basic notes. The core investment logic and business model, I hammered those out in the late hours. And I presented the core framework at last week's meeting, everyone here can vouch for that." She swept her glance across the room. Everyone looked down, silent. Megan was the director's favorite, smooth and well-connected. No one wanted to cross the rising star by defending a quiet, unsociable Sophie. The cold calculus of office politics was laid bare. The vice president, who had been observing, finally spoke, "Since there are conflicting claims, let's pull the original files from her machine. Timestamps will tell the truth." Megan went pale, her fingers clenching her jacket. Sophie felt a surge of relief. Finally, the truth could come out. An administrator came forward and accessed Sophie's computer. Sophie calmly opened the folder where she'd stored all her iterations, revision logs, and field trip images. Then her blood stopped. The folder was empty. Every draft, every log, every piece of raw data had vanished. All that remained was the final clean version, stripped of any editing history. No evidence. No traces. Nothing. Sophie's mind exploded. She whipped her head towards Megan. Megan was smiling at her, a private, cruel, triumphant smile. Sophie understood in that instant. After she'd left work last night, Megan had sneaked back to her desk and deleted all the original evidence. It had been planned, step by step, to destroy her completely. "Where's your evidence?" Connor demanded, his voice laced with disgust. "You speak so confidently, but you've got nothing. What more can you say?" Megan stood up gracefully, her tone magnanimous. "Director, let's not make this bigger. I think Sophie's just exhausted, she's not herself. I don't blame her. Let's continue." Her generosity only made Sophie look more unhinged. Every gaze turned to contempt. Terrible mentality, can't pull her weight and still tries to take credit. No wonder she never got promoted, so small-minded. Jealous of a colleague's success and making a scene, so cheap. The poisoned whispers drove needles into Sophie's heart. The vice president frowned and spoke with heavy disappointment. "In the workplace, character comes first. Losing your temper and fighting over credit shows you're not leadership material." Connor, seething, made his final decision. "Sophie, you've disrupted this meeting, damaged team morale, and shown poor conduct. Effective immediately, you are terminated." 3 years of work, erased in one sentence. Sophie stood frozen, cold to the bone, unable to speak. She looked at the upside-down courtroom of a meeting room, at the triumphant Megan, at the biased boss, at the colleagues who looked away, and felt her 3 years of silent endurance shatter. The meeting ended quickly. Everyone filed out. They all avoided her like she was garbage. Megan walked over slowly, stood over her, and whispered in her ear, just for the two of them, "Sophie, you're so naive. You thought hard work alone would win. In this world, it's about connections, tactics, and ruthlessness. Your proposal was excellent, too bad everything you have is now mine. You lost completely." Then she straightened, accepted everyone's congratulations, and left in a blaze of glory. Sophie stood alone in the empty meeting room, suffocating under layers of grievance and despair. She pulled out her phone and dialed Ethan. Everyone else had abandoned her, he was her last hope. He answered immediately. Sophie's voice broke, "Ethan, someone stole my work, I've been fired, everyone's against me." Before she could finish, a cold, flat voice came through the line. "Sophie, we're done." Her tears stopped mid-fall. "What?" I said. "We're over." His tone was as cold as if he were dismissing a stranger. "Megan and I have been together for a long time." A thunderclap, shattering her world. A long time. So the late-night tenderness had all been a lie. His promises of trust, all an act. Her boyfriend had been in cahoots with her enemy all along. He had watched her suffer, watched her be stabbed in the back, watched her humiliated, and done nothing, even encouraged it. "Why?" Sophie's voice shook. Ethan let out a cold laugh. "Sophie, you're too rigid, too boring, too inflexible. All you ever did was bury your head in work, no social skills, no flair. Being with you was exhausting. Megan is warm, smart, and ambitious. She's 1,000 times better for me. And now you've got nothing, you're beneath me." Beneath him. 3 words that crushed 5 years of her heart. "Don't contact me again. It's embarrassing." The line went dead. The cold dial tone was a death knell for her past. Career destroyed. Love gone. Reputation ruined. All alone. In one night, she hit rock bottom. Sophie closed her eyes and forced back every tear. She had cried, ached, despaired, and now she saw clearly. Gentleness brought no sincerity. Tolerance brought no dignity. Kindness was only weakness. From this moment, she would shed every soft edge and crush every naive hope. Those who had wronged her, shamed her, abandoned her, she would remember every one. Sophie walked out of the Peak Capitol Tower, and the midday sun was blindingly white. She didn't look back. Behind her, the 28-story glass curtain wall reflected her small, solitary figure like a giant mirror. She heard the access system beep behind her, a dismissive little sound that said she would never swipe that door open again. But her steps were steady. Her heels clicked on the granite pavement, one after another, light and heavy at once. Light, as though nothing had happened. Heavy, as though she were walking on her own splintered bones. She ducked into a corner shop and bought a bottle of iced water. Her fingers were still trembling as she twisted the cap. She tipped half the bottle down her throat, the chill tightening her throat. The shop assistant gave her a curious look, a young woman with smudged makeup, dark circles under her eyes, and a suit skirt stained with carpet fluff from the meeting room, standing under the fluorescent lights like a piece of porcelain that had been smashed and glued back together. She paid and stepped back onto the street, pulling out her phone. She scrolled through her contacts 3 times, not a single person she could call. 3 years of sacrificing every social hour for overtime, of cutting every personal connection down to just doing my job. She had believed that pure ability would earn her a place. And in the end, not a single witness had spoken for her. She gave a small laugh. Her mouth curved, but her eyes held no warmth. Then she hailed a taxi and gave the address of an old neighborhood on the south side. It was the first flat she'd rented after graduating, barely 200 square feet, no lift, a kitchen so narrow you could barely turn around. She'd spent countless late nights there, squeezed onto the rush hour tube, chewed on cheap pork buns that cost less than £1. Later, she'd moved in with Ethan and given the flat up, thinking she'd never need to come back. But she'd kept a key. It was tucked into the lining of her wardrobe. Back then, she still believed in keeping a fallback. Naive. She pushed the door open and a wave of stale, musty air hit her. Every piece of furniture was draped in white sheets, thick with dust. Sophie pulled one off and sat on the edge of the bed. The old wooden frame groaned under her weight. She pulled out her laptop, plugged it in, and opened a hidden partition. Inside the folder lay 32 draft versions of her proposal, 17 screen recordings of late-night edits, 217 raw formula sheets, geotagged photos from 3 site visits, scanned hotel receipts, taxi chits, even a photo of the till receipt from a convenience store coffee she'd bought on one of those field days. Megan had wiped every trace on her desktop. But Megan didn't know that Sophie was, by nature, paranoid. She'd kept 3 copies. One on the desktop, one in the cloud, one in a hidden partition. Megan thought deleting the desktop was enough. Sophie stared at the timestamps on the screen, each file marked with modified 09xx2026-314, created 09xx2026-147. Those 3 a.m. cursor blinks, those yawns while rewriting formulas before dawn, they were all frozen in the file properties, cold, factual, undeniable. She closed the folder and opened a browser. She typed in a URL. It was the Peak Capital intranet, and she still had admin privileges. When she'd joined 3 years ago, she'd been put in charge of migrating the department's data systems. The IT manager at the time had been too lazy to restrict access, so he'd given her the highest level permissions across the whole department. No one had ever asked for them back. Megan had assumed they were just basic data management rights. Sophie entered her password, paused for a second, then hit enter. The intranet backend opened before her, rows of employee IDs, login logs, file access records, a silent army of witnesses. She pulled up the logs from last night and this morning. Megan's employee ID, a login at 1:47 a.m., a delete operation on the desktop directory, a file overwrite record. She'd even opened the final proposal in Photoshop, changed the Sophie credit to Megan, and re-uploaded it to the server. The delete and overwrite timestamps were less than 3 minutes apart. Every step was documented. Sophie's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long time. Outside, the sun was sliding westward, an orange-gold light filtered through the dusty window panes, painting long shadows across her eyelashes. She was still wearing that morning's beige suit, the skirt crumpled like a piece of rumpled paper. She sat in the gathering dark for 4 hours. Then she moved. She screen-grabbed every log entry, recorded the screen, packaged everything, compressed and encrypted it. Then she laid out all the proposal iterations, time-stamped screenshots, photos, invoices, and travel receipts in a seamless, unbreakable timeline of evidence. She did it with the same flat expression she might have used to attach a file to a weekly report. But her eyes, those eyes that had once been as cold as a thin layer of ice on a lake, now held only one thing. Cold. Not the put-on stoicism of the wounded, but the deep, absolute cold of something that had frozen through, melted, and frozen again, never to recover its former temperature. When she finished, she made a phone call. It rang twice, then a low male voice answered, "Sophie? You're actually calling me?" The man was Dylan, Strategic Director of Oceanic Tourism, Peak Capital's main rival. Half a year ago, at an industry summit, he'd handed her his card and said, "Miss Sophie, Oceanic's door is always open for talent." She'd taken it politely, slipped it into a folder, and never looked at it again. Dylan was well-connected, sharp-eyed, and famous for poaching rising stars from other firms. "Mr. Dylan," Sophie said, her voice as steady as the last calm stretch before a storm, "I have the complete proposal for the £100 million cultural tourism town, full data, proprietary business models, all the modeling tools, plus an unalterable chain of timestamps that proves I created every bit of it from scratch." There was a 2-second silence on the other end. Dylan laughed. "What do you want?" "2 things. Her tone didn't waver. "First, send a formal letter from a solicitor to the chairman of Peak Capital, attaching the full evidence chain, demanding a public clarification, an apology, the reversal of my dismissal, and the pursuit of disciplinary action against those responsible. Second, after I join Oceanic, take the bidding eligibility for the suburban town project away from Peak Capital and put it in Oceanic's hands." Dylan let out a low whistle. "You want to wipe out Peak's entire tourism division?" "No. Sophie said. Just one person. She hung up. The next morning, Dylan moved fast. When the chairman's office at Peak Capital received the solicitor's letter, the whole floor went into uproar. The chairman personally pulled the intranet logs and confirmed that the back-end records matched Sophie's evidence perfectly. Megan's ID, the 1:47 a.m. login, the delete and overwrite actions, the IP address and terminal ID all locking onto her. Even more damning, Sophie's evidence included a video clip. She'd used her admin rights to pull the hallway security footage, which showed Megan returning to the office late at night, bending over Sophie's computer, and typing away. Ironclad. At 2 that afternoon, Peak Capital held an emergency internal review. Megan walked in still wearing her beige suit, her polite smile intact. She thought she was being called in for a promotion chat. She even winked at Connor as she entered. Then the chairman slammed the solicitor's letter on the table. Megan. Explain this. Megan's face went white at the first page. By the third page, when she saw the hallway surveillance stills, she crumpled like a puppet with its strings cut. Connor was there too. He stared at the evidence, his face turning purple, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. The chairman shot him a cold glance. Connor, your department management has been disastrous. Misjudging people, playing favorites, and publicly enabling misconduct, you share the blame. Connor's forehead beaded with sweat. He swallowed hard and forced out, Chairman. At the time Sophie really had no evidence. No evidence. The chairman's voice wasn't loud, but every word hit like a hammer. And that gives you the right to crush someone in public. How did you ever become a director? The room went dead silent. Megan suddenly looked up, tears streaming, and turned to Connor. Director Connor, please speak for me. I really didn't. Connor looked away. He knew better than anyone what Megan had sent him on WeChat last night, a selfie at 2 a.m., captioned, working so late, you must be tired too, Director. He'd replied, get some rest, I'm counting on you tomorrow. Now he wished he could erase that message from the space-time continuum. Chairman, Connor stood up, his voice hoarse, I misjudged personnel and made bad decisions. I accept managerial responsibility. Megan watched him fold, her lips trembling. She turned to the other colleagues around the table. No one looked at her. They were all studying their notebooks, the ceiling, their own hangnails. Yesterday she'd been the rising star. Today she was a departmental liability. The chairman delivered the final verdict. Megan was terminated with immediate effect and an internal disciplinary notice. Connor was demoted with a 6-month probationary pay cut. Sophie's reputation was to be restored, a formal apology issued, the dismissal revoked, and 3 months severance paid. But Sophie didn't take the severance. She didn't even wait for the apology letter. At 5 that afternoon, Sophie sat in Oceanic Tourism's reception area in a black shirt, facing Dylan. In front of her lay an employment contract, Senior Director of Strategic Investment, with a doubled base salary and separate project bonuses. Dylan slid a pen across the table. Thought it through. Sophie picked up the pen and signed her name on every line. The scratch of the nib was light and quick. When do we fire the first shot? She asked. Dylan pushed his phone towards her. On the screen was a countdown, the public bidding for the Cultural Tourism Town project, deadline 7 days from now. Peak's proposal is still based on your old framework. Megan copied your core logic, but their modeling capacity is weak, they are missing a crucial dynamic variable. You take the complete version in there, they won't have a leg to stand on. Sophie stared at the countdown. 7 days. 7 days ago, she'd been publicly crushed in Peak's 28th floor conference room. In 7 days, she'd sit on the other side of the bidding table, with her own knife, to carve back her own flesh. She closed her laptop and stood. Dylan, I need a lawyer. For what? Sophie's mouth curved into the faintest smile, like a blade bending in the dark. Suing Ethan. Civil litigation. He took £46,000 from my account under the pretense of household expenses. I didn't have a written IOU, but I have bank transfers and chat records. I want every penny back, with interest. Dylan stared, then shook his head with a laugh. Sophie, this isn't a rebirth, you've taken yourself apart and forged a whole new set of armor. Sophie didn't answer. She walked to the window and looked down at the evening rush hour traffic. Neon signs were flickering on one by one, the city's nightscape rose around her, softening her outline. Her phone screen lit up. An unknown number. She answered. It was Megan's voice, hoarse, frantic, tearful. Sophie. Sophie, please, drop the complaint, I beg you. I've lost my job, everyone in the industry knows what I did, I'll never work again. Please, just let it go. Sophie listened to the end. She didn't say a single word. Then she hung up and blocked the number. The moment her phone went back into her pocket, it buzzed again, Ethan. She didn't answer, just rejected the call and blocked him too. Silence fell. The last sliver of daylight sank below the horizon, night flooded in. Sophie stood at a 26th floor window, behind her an unfamiliar office, unfamiliar computers, unfamiliar colleagues, and a future she was about to tear apart and rebuild with her own hands. She looked down at her hands. Those hands had typed through countless 3 a.m. sessions, clutched cold coffee cups, and gripped her evidence chain for 4 hours in the dark. They were empty now. But they felt stronger than ever. Dylan's voice came from the doorway. Sophie, the lawyer's here. Also, your office is ready. It's by the window, and you can see the direction of your old desk from here. Sophie turned. Her black shirt sleeves were rolled to her forearms, revealing lean wrists full of tension. Her face was expressionless, but behind her eyes something was slowly, steadily glowing, like iron heated to white. Let's go, she said. Time to work. 7 days later, at the bidding conference for the suburban cultural tourism town, Sophie sat at Oceanic Tourism's main presentation desk. In the front row sat Peak Capital's vice president, the same man who, at the final review, had pronounced her unfit for major responsibilities. His expression was a picture. When Sophie put up her slide, the credit line in the lower right corner read clearly, Lead Creator, Sophie, Oceanic Tourism Strategic Investment. She stood, back straight, voice clear and sharp as a newly unsheathed blade. Good morning, everyone. I will now present the full core data for the £100 million cultural tourism town proposal. She clicked to the next slide. On the big screen, 217 dynamic modeling sets unfolded seamlessly: zoning, risk mitigation, investment return cycles, peak visitor capacity projections, every figure precise to 2 decimal places. Dead silence in the hall. The Peak vice president's fingers dug into his armrest. Halfway through, Sophie paused. Her gaze swept the room and caught a figure in the back corner, Megan, who had somehow sneaked in, huddled in the shadows of the last row, her face as grey as burnt paper. Sophie met her eyes. Just for a second. Then she looked away and continued, her voice as even as if she'd seen nothing. When the presentation ended, the room erupted in applause. Oceanic Tourism won the exclusive bidding rights by a landslide. As she walked out through the crowd, Dylan fell in beside her, grinning, that VP's face is going to keep me laughing for a year. Sophie didn't reply. She stepped out of the venue, and the evening wind hit her. October air had already turned cool. She tilted her head back and looked up at the deep blue sky. One star shone especially bright, like a lamp lit somewhere far, far away. She stood still for a long while. Then she lowered her head, pulled her coat tighter, and walked towards the car park. Behind her was the brightly lit conference hall, the respect, the reputation, the dignity she'd clawed back. Ahead was the still dark, still long, still thorny road. But her feet were on the ground. One step, then another. As steady as nails driven into wood. Sophie got into her car and started the engine. Her phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. "Congratulations. You did it." She stared at the text for 2 seconds, then didn't reply. She tossed the phone into the passenger seat, shifted into gear, and merged into the river of city lights. The colors streamed past the windows, flickering across her face. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, not even a trace of relief. Only a very calm, very clean look, like the bare metal left after everything had been scoured away. Cold as steel. And bright as a blade. The groundbreaking ceremony dawned clear and bright. A temporary stage had been erected on the construction site, red carpet unrolled all the way, colored flags snapping in the wind. 3 district officials attended, a dozen press outlets showed up, cameras and tripods crowding the podium. Sophie stood at the side in a charcoal grey cashmere coat, clutching her 3-minute speech. Dylan clapped her shoulder. Nervous? Not at all. She meant it. The moment she stepped onto the stage, every camera swung towards her. She scanned the crowd, familiar faces from Oceanic, representatives from partner firms, and one figure standing in the far corner of the last row, dark-framed glasses, navy suit, hands in pockets, watching her with a faint, measuring smile. Sophie recognized him instantly. Nathan. Peak Capital's new tourism director, in person. She held his gaze for a split second, then looked away. She folded her notes and slipped them into her pocket. She didn't need them, and began. "Ladies and gentlemen, everyone here today. What I want to say isn't about tourism trends or billion-pound opportunities. I want to say just one thing. This project was conceived and built, from nothing, by one person typing at a computer in the small hours of the morning. That person is me." A beat of silence, then applause rippled from every corner. Sophie continued, "But I'm not standing here alone. Yesterday, my colleague Oscar drew 3 wavy lines across the Plot 3 map, added £280,000 to the budget, and turned a quarter-mile walk into 3 separate scenic experiences. The day before, our retail assistant recovered 72 pages of data that had been shredded from a government file. And the day before that, Dylan stood in front of the board and said, 'This project is getting built even if we have to sell the furniture.'" She paused, her eyes sweeping past Nathan's face. "So today, I want to call this groundbreaking, quenching. When red-hot iron is plunged into water, it hisses, smokes, sheds its impurities. It hurts. But when it's done, it's harder than before." She finished with a slight bow and stepped down. The applause was louder than when she'd gone up. As she walked through the crowd, she felt a gaze tracking her from the side, assessing, weighing. She didn't turn. She kept walking to the backstage area. Dylan was waiting, his expression complicated. Nathan heard every word. "I know." He didn't smile once. Of course he didn't. Sophie took a bottle of water he offered and drank. Peak just lost £100 million project. If he could smile through that, I'd be more worried. Dylan studied her. "What's your plan for him?" Sophie twisted the cap back on and thought for a moment. "He came today not to watch me, he came to measure me. A new player taking over a mess needs to know how deep the other side's reserves are. And how deep are yours?" Sophie looked up at Dylan, a faint curve at the corner of her mouth. What he saw today was just an ace. Dylan blinked. "Then what else do you have?" Sophie didn't answer. She walked towards the rest area, passing Oscar, who was still scrolling on his phone. As she went by, he murmured without looking up, good speech. She paused. You heard the wavy lines bit? Oscar raised his eyes, still deadpan. Yeah. Solid. Less sentimental than I expected. Sophie laughed out loud for the first time in weeks. In the week after the groundbreaking, the project shifted fully into construction. Sophie moved her office from the 26th floor to a temporary site cabin beside the works. The cabin was basic, poorly insulated, and the excavators started roaring before dawn, but she found it grounding. Numbers felt more real when you could see the dirt moving. She arrived every morning at 7, walked the site first to compare actual progress with the schedule, then held a team meeting in the cabin. Oscar arrived half an hour later, usually with a black coffee, sitting in a corner and listening, occasionally chipping in about design to construction adjustments. Their exchanges were stripped to the bone, like two parallel motorways with occasional slip roads to exchange information before diverging again. The Megan and Ethan civil case came to court 10 days after the groundbreaking. Sophie took a half-day off, put on a black suit, and arrived at the district court on time. Grace was already in the lobby with her manila file. The other side come? Yes. Grace lowered her voice. Ethan has a lawyer, a newly qualified one, from the look of it. Also, Megan is in the public gallery. Sophie's step faltered. Megan, too. She drew a breath and pushed through the courtroom doors. The room was small, 3 rows of benches in the gallery. Megan sat in the back corner, in a plain jumper, her hair loose, her face pale and hollowed, as if she'd lost a stone. When she saw Sophie, her lips moved, as though she wanted to speak, but no words came. At the defendant's table, Ethan sat in a crisp suit, hair neatly combed, but his tie was crooked. Sophie recognized it, she'd bought it for his last birthday. She stared at the crooked knot for 2 seconds, then looked away and took her seat at the plaintiff's table. Ethan's eyes followed her, wearing that familiar expression she'd once found tender and now recognized as pure performance, the slight downturned mouth, the furrowed brow, the "why are you doing this to me" look. Sophie didn't look back. The judge banged the gavel. Proceedings began. Grace's presentation was methodical, transfer records, chat screenshots, a clear timeline, every piece locked onto the evidence. Ethan's lawyer tried to argue shared living expenses, but Grace had prepared a counter. She extracted 3 separate chat exchanges where Ethan had written, "The project bonus hasn't come in yet, can you cover this for me and I'll pay you back," and, "The car needs new tires, transfer me $2,000 and I'll give it back after my year-end bonus." Ethan's face drained of color. When Ethan himself took the stand, he cleared his throat and opened with, "Sophie, we were partners. These were everyday expenses during our relationship. I didn't expect you to." Grace cut in immediately. "The witness is asked to stick to facts, not emotional commentary." The judge tapped his gavel. "Defendant, limit your answers to the nature of the transfers." Ethan's lips pressed into a line. He was silent for a few seconds, then said quietly, "Those sums were loans." Sophie sat at the plaintiff's table, watching the droop of Ethan's lashes, the slight tremor of his fingers, his face drained by the courtroom lighting. 5 years ago, in the university library, the first time he'd spoken to her, he'd been bent at that same angle, asking, "Are you done with this urban economics textbook?" She'd pushed it across to him, he'd taken it, the cover still warm from her palm. Now the courtroom air conditioning hummed, and her palms were empty. The hearing lasted 2 hours. The judge found in favor of the plaintiff in full. Ethan was ordered to repay the principal of £46,300 plus interest, with daily penalties for late payment. When the gavel fell, Sophie heard a muffled sob from the gallery. She turned. Megan had covered her mouth with both hands, tears were streaming through her fingers. Sophie watched her. In that moment, a cascade of images flashed through her mind. Megan on the final review day, reciting Sophie's proposal word for word, Megan leaning over Sophie's desk, her face inches from the screen, Megan in the lift, smiling, saying, "I'll cover for you tomorrow." They flickered past, then sank. Sophie looked away. She gathered her papers and stood to leave. Ethan called from the defendant's table, "Sophie." She stopped. Ethan's voice was hoarse, exhausted. "I'll pay back the money. But can you let me just say I'm sorry?" Sophie stood with her back to him for 2 seconds. "No need," she said. She walked out. Her footsteps echoed in the empty corridor, each one sharp, like stepping on pieces of something old and breaking it apart. Grace caught up and handed her a copy of the judgment. "Clean win. I'll handle enforcement. Focus on your project." Sophie thanked her. They reached the courthouse steps. Autumn sunlight poured down, bleaching the granite white. Grace left first. Sophie stood on the steps, pulling out her phone to call a taxi, when she sensed someone behind her. Megan. She stood 3 paces back, her eyes still red, hair tousled by the wind. She opened her mouth, her voice thin and raw. "Sophie. I saw you look back at me in there. You didn't say anything. You just walked away. Why didn't you shout at me?" Sophie turned to face her. The wind shook the row of ginkgo trees outside the courthouse, sending golden fan-shaped leaves tumbling onto Megan's jumper. "Shout at you for what?" Sophie's voice was even. "What you did, the law and the industry will answer it. I don't need to add my own kick." Megan's tears came again. "But I've lost everything, my job, my reputation, everyone knows I stole your work. Ethan won't even talk to me anymore." Sophie let her finish, then asked, "Megan, do you remember that day you told me, in this world, it's about intelligence, connections, and tactics?" Megan blinked, then nodded. "You were right." Sophie tilted her head slightly, her gaze drifting to the bare branches in the distance. "Intelligence, connections, tactics, they matter. But you missed one thing: what you have has to be yours. Stolen things don't stay in your hands for long. They always come due." She turned and slid into the waiting taxi. As the door closed, she watched in the wing mirror as Megan stood under the ginkgo tree, surrounded by fallen leaves, her shoulders caved in like a paper lantern with its frame removed. Sophie looked away. The taxi joined the main road, the city began to flow past. She looked down at her open palms, clean, empty, but solid. Back at the site, it was already 2 in the afternoon. Dylan was waiting in the cabin, a file open on the table. When Sophie walked in, he looked up, his usual lightness tempered. "Case done?" "Done." "Win?" "Win." Dylan slid the file across to her. "Then read this." Nathan's made his move. Sophie sat down and opened it. It was a photocopy of a leaked internal memo from Oceanic Tourism, a report about a safety hazard at the project site, a patch of underground karst caves on the southeast corner of plot 4 that hadn't been mentioned in the original survey. If construction proceeded, the memo warned, the ground could collapse. "I personally oversaw the survey," Sophie said, frowning. "There are no karst caves." Dylan lit a cigarette, took a drag, and exhaled slowly. "There aren't." Sophie looked away. She gathered her papers and stood to leave. Ethan called from the defendant's table, "Sophie." She stopped. Ethan's voice was hoarse, exhausted. "I'll pay back the money. But can you let me just say I'm sorry?" Sophie stood with her back to him for 2 seconds. "No need," she said. She walked out. Her footsteps echoed in the empty corridor, each one sharp, like stepping on pieces of something old and breaking it apart. Grace caught up and handed her a copy of the judgment. "Clean win. I'll handle enforcement. Focus on your project." Sophie thanked her. They reached the courthouse steps. Autumn sunlight poured down, bleaching the granite white. Grace left first. Sophie stood on the steps, pulling out her phone to call a taxi, when she sensed someone behind her. Megan. She stood 3 paces back, her eyes still red, hair tousled by the wind. She opened her mouth, her voice thin and raw. Sophie. I saw you look back at me in there. You didn't say anything. You just walked away. Why didn't you shout at me? Sophie turned to face her. The wind shook the row of ginkgo trees outside the courthouse, sending golden fan-shaped leaves tumbling onto Megan's jumper. Shout at you for what? Sophie's voice was even. What you did, the law and the industry will answer it. I don't need to add my own kick. Megan's tears came again. But I've lost everything, my job, my reputation, everyone knows I stole your work. Ethan won't even talk to me anymore. Sophie let her finish, then asked, Megan, do you remember that day you told me, in this world, it's about intelligence, connections, and tactics? Megan blinked, then nodded. You were right. Sophie tilted her head slightly, her gaze drifting to the bare branches in the distance. Intelligence, connections, tactics, they matter. But you missed one thing, what you have has to be yours. Stolen things don't stay in your hands for long. They always come due. She turned and slid into the waiting taxi. As the door closed, she watched in the wing mirror as Megan stood under the ginkgo tree, surrounded by fallen leaves, her shoulders caved in like a paper lantern with its frame removed. Sophie looked away. The taxi joined the main road, the city began to flow past. She looked down at her open palms, clean, empty. But solid. Back at the site, it was already 2 in the afternoon. Dylan was waiting in the cabin, a file open on the table. When Sophie walked in, he looked up, his usual lightness tempered. Case done? Done. Win? Win. Dylan slid the file across to her. Then read this. Nathan's made his move. Sophie sat down and opened it. It was a photocopy of a leaked internal memo from Oceanic Tourism, a report about a safety hazard at the project site, a patch of underground karst caves on the southeast corner of Plot 4 that hadn't been mentioned in the original survey. If construction proceeded, the memo warned, the ground could collapse. I personally oversaw the survey, Sophie said, frowning. There are no karst caves. Dylan lit a cigarette, took a drag, and exhaled slowly. There aren't. But Nathan hired a third-party geological firm to produce a supplementary report, claiming there are. That report has now been submitted to the District Safety Bureau. They're sending a team this afternoon. They want our original survey data to verify. We have the original data. Sophie stood. Full 24-core drill records, core sample photographs, the original testing reports, they're all in my files. Dylan looked at her, stubbing out the cigarette. Problem is, the borehole coordinates in that supplementary report are an exact match for the coordinates in your original report. Think about what that means. Sophie's fingers stilled on the paper edge. Exact match. It meant Nathan had someone on the inside, someone who had access to her original survey data. They'd fabricated a supplementary report using the same coordinate numbers, then planted a conclusion about karst caves that didn't exist. Anyone comparing the two would see the same borehole IDs and assume the original had missed something crucial. An informant, Sophie said. Correct. Dylan nodded. Someone on your project team passed the original data out. The cabin went quiet for a few seconds. Outside, the faint rumble of excavators continued, the construction schedule ticking steadily on the digital board. Everything looked orderly, but Sophie knew the knife was already at her throat. She closed the file. When does the Safety Bureau arrive? 5:30. Sophie glanced at the clock. 4:10. Just over an hour. She opened her drawer, pulled out the USB drive with the original survey, plugged it in, and pulled up the 24-core records, rock sample photos, and the signed original reports. Then she began comparing Nathan's supplementary report with her own data, point by point. She spotted the flaw fast. Nathan's report claimed that cores 4, 8, and 15 encountered karst caves at a depth of 12 meters. But her original records showed that those 3 boreholes had only reached 9.5 meters, because the layer below that was solid granite, and the drill bit couldn't go deeper. If the drill hadn't even reached 12 meters, how could it have found caves at 12? She screen-grabbed the comparison, flagged it, packaged it, and printed 3 hard copies from the cabin printer. At 4:30, she carried those 3 folders out and waited with Dylan for the safety bureau's car. The sun slanted from the west, stretching the shadows of scaffolding and cranes long and crooked across the site. Sophie stood at the cabin door, squinting into the wind. She sent Oscar a message, survey data leaked. Check who accessed the shared folder in the past week. Oscar replied instantly, on it. She pocketed the phone and looked out at the darkening sky. Nathan's strike was well aimed, dirty, and clever. But she could handle it. Because her hand wasn't just the original survey data. Her real hand was the backup she'd kept. Back when she'd first joined Peak and migrated all their project archives, she'd made a private copy of every historical version, every modification log, every download record. Just out of instinct. Instinct had saved her more than once. The Safety Bureau team arrived at 20 to 6, 3 men, 1 woman, led by a senior Inspector Jew. Sophie laid out the original data and her side-by-side comparison, walking them through the logic. Drilling depth insufficient, the so-called karst caves can't possibly exist. Inspector Jew examined her 3 folders, his expression shifting several times. He called the third-party geological firm on the spot and demanded their original drilling logs. They stammered that the logs were still being organized. Jew hung up, his face grim. He turned to Sophie. Miss Sophie, we will open an investigation into this. Falsifying testing data and maliciously interfering with a key project are serious offenses. If proven, we'll refer the matter to law enforcement. Sophie thanked him. We'll fully cooperate. After they'd gone, darkness fell. The site floodlights came on, bleaching the scaffolding bright white. Sophie stood under them, her shadow a small dark circle at her feet. Dylan walked over with a cup of hot tea, his expression one of relief mixed with unease. Nathan's move was dirty. Without your original drilling depth records, just matching the borehole IDs wouldn't have been enough. Sophie cradled the tea, feeling the heat through the cup. He didn't know I'd backed up every historical version. She took a sip. Nathan plans 3 steps ahead, but he never factored in the 3 years I spent at Peak. Every minute I worked there, I was learning. Dylan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised her. Sophie, have you considered that Nathan isn't just doing this for the project? She looked up. I had some people check, Dylan went on, his voice dropping. Nathan's relationship with Megan, back when she was at Peak, he was her rotation mentor. They were close. After Megan was fired, Nathan contacted her immediately. More than once. Sophie's pupils contracted. So Nathan's avenging Megan. On the surface. Dylan took out his cigarette case, then put it back, restraining himself. But the deeper reason is, Nathan is pathologically protective of his people. Anyone who hurts someone he's mentored, he pays back tenfold. You hurt Megan, you bruised his ego. Every move he's making now is to repair that bruised ego. Sophie put down her teacup and stared into the blue-tinted night lights of the site. Ego, she repeated softly. Yes. Dylan sighed. Your project, your bid, your acclaimed reputation, none of that matters to him. What matters is that you made him look bad. Sophie stood silent for a long time. The wind swept in from the open ground beyond the site, carrying the raw smell of earth and steel. She remembered Megan's whisper at the final review, "You lost, completely." Now she understood. Megan's backing wasn't just Connor. Connor was the front, Nathan was the hidden support underground. She exhaled slowly, her breath misting white in the floodlight. "Then I'll crush that ego," she said, her voice low but each word hard as gravel. "Completely." Dylan said nothing more. Back in her cabin late that night, Sophie opened her laptop and found a message from Oscar, a screenshot of the shared folder's access logs. One user account had downloaded the complete survey data 3 days ago at 2:17 a.m. Account owner, Leo, a site engineer's assistant. Sophie stared at the name. Leo, 23 years old, a fresh graduate, for months on the job, quiet and diligent, the youngest in her team. At the groundbreaking ceremony, he'd stood in the crowd, clapping, smiling like a boy. Sophie saved the screenshot and replied to Oscar with 3 words, "Hold for now." She closed the computer and lay on the camp bed, staring at the ceiling. A crack ran from the light fitting to the northeast corner, like a tiny bolt of lightning. She traced it with her eyes, running through everyone who'd touched the survey data in the past week, her 4 core team members, 3 contractor representatives, 2 site supervisors, plus Leo. Only Leo's account had a late-night download record. But Sophie's instinct told her it wasn't that simple. A fresh graduate, for months into his first job, where did he get the nerve to leak core data? And how did he connect to Nathan? There had to be someone behind him. She closed her eyes in the dark, rearranging the known pieces. The Safety Bureau frame-up, the survey data leak, Leo's download, Nathan's tie to Megan. There was one line missing. How did Nathan get the exact file IDs? If Nathan had only received a download from Leo, he'd have the data content, but his supplementary report used the exact same borehole numbers and coordinate tags as Sophie's original. That meant he'd got the whole file, not just the numbers. And Leo had only downloaded once. One download, the full package. So Nathan had taken Sophie's original file, changed the conclusion, and reissued it as supplementary. It was the only way the IDs could match perfectly. Sophie opened her eyes in the dark. What if Nathan had more than one informant? Leo was just the hand that passed the file. Behind that hand, someone else was orchestrating, telling him what to send, how to send it, how to cover tracks. That someone was probably in her core team. She turned over and pulled the blanket tight. The cabin's insulation was poor, late autumn wind squeezed through the door gaps, moaning. She listened to it and thought, tomorrow, she'd need a thicker duvet. But more urgently, she needed to flush out the rat.